Hey everyone, today is a very big day and a day for you all to feel pretty powerful. It's Women's Equality Day here in the United States, and we have with us a really special guest. Of course, we have Keely and Michaela, who you all know, but we also have Rachel Thomas. Rachel is the president and the co-founder of the Lean In organization, the foundation, and of course you may know it from Sheryl Sandberg's very famous book of the same name, which was the co-founder to you, Rachel, in starting this incredible foundation. I think we've got a great conversation ahead of us. We're going to get started with some light and unknown facts about Women's Equality Day. I've got the first one, which is 1920 is when we got the right to vote in this country. But I know you guys have some other interesting facts to share. So
I do. I'll share one that it kind of blew my mind, which was that in 1920, when we were given the right to vote, 16 other countries around the world had already done this, including the USSR, which is now, of course, Russia. But I was just amazed that they had given the women the right to vote and we didn't have it in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I find hard to believe. I know, Rachel, you obviously have a head full of stats, yes. But tell us something about where we are on, kind of, from your perspective.
Sure, one of the things that's really interesting is for every dollar a man makes, on average, a woman makes 77 cents. And that is mind-blowing to me. It's getting better, but it's not good enough.
Right, so still a ways to go on equal pay for equal work. And probably one other fact that I think is worth sharing, which was a surprise to me in a positive sense. A couple of years ago, I was on a panel or an advisory committee for Maria Shriver for this body of work called A Women's Nation. And in it, she found that, in fact, women are already the economic breadwinners in this country, meaning we account for over 50% of the GDP in the United States. So, you know, I guess some great facts in how far we've come, but also some things we're going to work on, including today, which is learning how to negotiate for yourself, particularly at work. So we're going to start off with Rachel, talking a little bit about your favorite tips for negotiating. But before we do that, I think you told me a pretty touching story about your arrival at Lean In and how you explained your work to your son. So it would be great for you to share that.
So when I accepted the job, my kids really wanted to know what Lean In was all about. One of the stories I told my son, in particular Gavin, was, what if I told you that if mommy had the very same job as daddy and worked almost the exact amount of hours, I likely wouldn't make as much money? And he thought for a second, and he looked right at me and said, Mommy, I don't think that's fair. And it isn't fair, and that's why we're here to talk about negotiation today.
And how to figure it out. So I think our goal for today is really to get from Rachel, I think, as a starting point, some really practical tips for how it is that we can negotiate for what we want at work. So Rachel, I'm going to sort of turn to you. What is your advice for women, particularly in the workplace, on how to get what we want?
So one of the first things is body language. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what we're going to say, and we often forget how we're positioning ourselves and the intonation of our voice. This is universally valuable, not just for negotiation, but think about how you're going to position yourself, keep your voice very calm, present yourself as someone who's confident and deserves what you're asking for, and that'll make a big difference. And one helpful tip I really like is, I learned this at Lean In, actually. I call it the Wonder Woman pose. Okay. If you stand like this for about 3 minutes, cortisol levels go down, testosterone levels go up, and I actually will feel physically more confident. So I do this all the time. The team makes fun of me, but you often see me doing it before anything I'm a bit nervous about.
Okay, so tip one is really kind of physically how you present yourself and your body language, including revving up for that conversation and getting those levels up. Quick question for you just on that before we go to the next one. You also talked about intonation and talking confident. Is it true that women often present negotiations as a question versus a statement, and does that make a difference?
So that makes a huge difference. So when you're assessed, it's typically 7% what you say, 55% how you're positioning your body, and the rest roughly is the intonation of your voice. And we have all heard women fall into the trap of finishing with a question. Don't ask a question, tell people what you want.
Okay, so tip number one, watch the body language, and remember actually the Wonder Woman pose to get ready, you know, and get confident before you go in.
That's right.
What else would you tell us to do?
So we all feel this, like we know that we get judged a little bit differently as women, and studies show this as well. So when women are seen as being very demanding or aggressive, they're often not liked. So, and we've all felt this before. So when you go into a negotiation, one tip to combat that is men can use I language. I deserve, I've done. Not so much for women. Women should use more communal language. We. If this happens, the team will be stronger. Here's what I'll be able to do for you. Here's how we'll work together. That's the type of language that women need to use. So it's moving from I to we.
Got it. Well, one of the things I think you're saying is that basically, much as we might wish it were not the case, the fact is that we are often judged for or perceived as being too aggressive if we ask for what we want in certain language, and it may work against us.
That's right.
So I guess being savvy in a negotiation is recognizing that maybe we do need to use slightly different language than we might otherwise think.
And one point I want to make is I don't want to be giving this advice, right? It's a bit of a chicken and egg, right? But let's understand the environment that we're in and work within that.
Now, is it the same as if you're negotiating with a woman as if you are with a man, as a woman?
So gender bias is really interesting. Women and men are equally prone to gender bias.
Oh, interesting. So you might have the same thing with a boss who's female as you may with a male in terms of how you're perceived.
Exactly. And it's because we're all good people. We don't mean to exercise bias, but we all fall into the cognitive shortcuts that get us into bias trouble. And women and men do it equally. And that's a really important learning, I think.
Interesting. So one of the key kind of facts here is that women may be as likely as men to judge us as too aggressive.
That's absolutely right.
Sometimes I think women are harder on other women.
In terms of this,
Yeah, in terms of expectations and negotiation and things like that.
Yeah. We've certainly seen kind of this. Sometimes we all feel it, but hopefully our job is to lift all women up with this advice. But recognizing we have a gender bias ourselves is an interesting thing. I mean, it's not something I would have thought of, but certainly could be the case. And kind of tip number 3, what else have you got for us?
So when you know you want something, start with the pre-negotiation. So go in, sit down with a boss, a principal, whoever it is, tell them what you want, and then ask them what you need to get there. And that's really helpful because now you know your target. What do I need to do to get what I'm asking for? And you actually know how to sell it in, because they've told you why it's important to them, and you can use a lot of their same language back to them when you're negotiating.
So you're basically recommending that before your negotiation conversation, there is a pre-negotiation conversation.
That's right.
That may not be evident to him or her, but you're saying it's evident to you as as sort of gathering information on what's important to the person you're negotiating with.
That's exactly right.
Okay. All right. So 3 great tips, which is amazing. Michaela Keeley, when you think about your experiences with negotiation, can you think about a positive experience you've had with negotiation and what you've been able to do successfully?
For me, I negotiate with clients on rates and things all the time as a stylist. And I remember the first time that I really was like, you know what, if they don't want to work with me, that's kind of their decision, but this is what I need to do. And the minute I kind of in my head had that stance, they started falling in line, and they were like, okay, yeah, I kind of got that, I see that value in you as well, because I saw it in myself.
Right, so sort of once you set a backstop on what really was unacceptable for you, you think it translated?
I think it translated, and maybe it was body language or how I was saying it or something unconscious to me, but it really made a difference once I got that in my head.
Right, but it sounds like you drew your own line in the sand in your head, and once you were comfortable with that line in the sand,
no matter what,
the tenor of your negotiations changed.
Yep.
And one thing that's really interesting, we get hundreds of emails from women who've negotiated, and they're equally positive whether or not they got what they wanted. So what I think is really interesting about they feel good they just asked, and that they were perceived differently, and that it will go better next time.
Oh, interesting. Right, so the win is actually negotiating and negotiating prowess, regardless of the result.
Right.
Michaela, any stories to share from your perspective?
Sure, yeah. So when I think about negotiating, it's sort of similar to Keely's, but understanding, I think, your personality and having that confidence to really express what you want. Over the years, I've learned that I'm actually a natural introvert, and I think over half of our population is actually introverts, and they want to go inward, and sometimes that can be perceived as being soft, and not, we're often classified as like the silent influencer. So when we recognize that and kind of take ownership of that, and then we're able to learn these specific behaviors to identify with and explain and say in confidence what we want, it's been tremendously helpful. And I think that's something that I think a lot of women, a lot of friends that I know identify with, because we have this idea in our head of what someone who is assertive, I think, looks like and feels like, and sometimes it's raising your voice or being over assertive, but I think when we can kind of own our own power and each of ourselves and our personalities, it's going to help us regardless, right?
Right. And the other thing to remind yourself of next time is men tend to overestimate their skills and women tend to underestimate ours. So just, you have to like correct for that manually.
Yeah, no, I think you do actually. I mean, I often say, you know, here in the Valley, people ask me if there's a gender bias. And I actually say I don't think there is, but there is a stereotype of what people expect confidence to look like. And sometimes what I often tell women is confidence comes from deep knowledge. You know, and I think that's true in a negotiation as well. So one of my key kind of tips for negotiating is it's very easy to negotiate when you know something so deeply well. So when I go into a negotiation, and keep in mind, I grew up also in sales, right? So I spent a lot of time negotiating in my career. One of the things I always do is I always have my first position and my fallback position and my final position. And I have them all laid out in bullet points because I often expect negotiations to be iterative cycles. It's not one and done. So I think if you know deeply what your first position is, your second position, and your final position, you prepare yourself for a cycle of conversations and you know the data better than the person you're negotiating against. And I think for me that's always been a key kind of to owning it. So look, I think there's a lot of great advice here on how to make negotiations work for you. Obviously from our perspective, we'd love to hear from you on our Facebook page or on Twitter. This is a day to actually celebrate, I think, how far we've come and recognize that we probably all have amazing stories to share on how to do it even better. And that's the spirit of the conversation today. We're gonna wrap up with a sneak peek of what's coming next week on Joyus. But as we do, we would love to have you post your favorite anecdotes, stories to share, what you've done to really embrace power, and positive examples for you here on Women's Equality Day. The first 5 posts to Facebook for us will get a personally signed copy from Cheryl of Lean In. Rachel was kind enough, and Cheryl, to make this happen. So personally signed, we've got 5 to give away, and we would love to have you tell your stories and share them with us. With that, we're going to say goodbye, and we'll see you next week on Joyus.
Okay, bye.
Bye.